We fixed Sombra, we fixed Bastion, we fixed Junkrat, we fixed Pharah, we fixed Torbjorn, and we fixed Reaper. This was a rather ambitious project. But first, let me talk about what I actually mean by fix them. I don't have an inner circle with the devs. I don't have any fast track. I don't even know if any of these heroes beyond Sombra are going to get reworks. But I'm the type of person that I have issues with these characters, whether it's their skill expression, they're frustrating to play against, they're not really scaled well in higher ranks, or they're too powerful in higher ranks. And regardless of that situation, I wanted to provide something besides criticism. I actually wanted to provide, okay, well, if I'm going to criticize, what are you going to, what would you do differently? Being a game developer is really, really hard. Designing heroes is really, really hard, and it's easy for us to throw stones. So I was like, well, instead of just throwing stones about some of my least favorite characters in Overwatch 2 on the DPS side of things, what would we change about those characters to make them more fun to play against, and reward skill expression without compromising their ability to perform at really all ranks, right? Because that's the goal. We want heroes that can perform in bronze and top 500 at the same time. Heroes that scale well with skill expression, whether they're Reinhardt or Genji, something along those lines. Now, we want to do more of these with other heroes. We're going to do some of these with a couple of other DPS heroes. We're going to do these with supports and a couple of tanks as well in the future, so stay tuned. And these were mostly not my ideas. I was the guy that compiled all those ideas, the ones that I like specifically, so there's an inherent little bit of bias about what I think the hero should do, so keep that in mind. But these are from hundreds of suggestions that I had from Twitter, people that actually joined my Discord. I had a huge channel set up where people would submit their ideas for these different heroes, from people that main the character and bronze all the way up to top 500 players. So we had a lot of really good ideas, a lot of great discussion on Twitch chat. We actually took, what was it? It might have been 7 or 8 hours almost, I think, for me to between on live and afterwards to kind of compile these ideas. A lot of great discussion, not everybody on the same page. And so, you know, you may disagree, you may agree, but I think overall these are going to be some good changes. So let's start off with Sombra. So with Sombra, the key things that we want to talk about were that the things that make the hero fun are some of her dynamics, her positioning, and her translocator and moving about the map. However, things that make Sombra very frustrating to play against, problems with the character, is that she's really hard to play in lower ranks. So it's hard to get good effective value. She scales really well at higher ranks, which is awesome. So she's got a nice little skill curve going. But the problem is just there are many things about her kit, especially in high ranks, that are really, really frustrating to play against. Permanent stealth, really frustrating. Hack, really frustrating. Translocator constantly being a get out of jail free card, really frustrating. Even EMP power spike. So whatever we did with Sombra is we wanted to complement the things that are fun about her while also assaulting some of the things that make her feel really bad. So the first thing we want to talk about with Sombra is her translocator. It's kind of a cooldown right now where it puts her all in or all out of the battlefield, and that's kind of bad because that's part of the reason why people really struggle with her in lower ranks, is the fact that the translocator is either a completely get out of jail free card or something that a lot of lower rank Sombras use to exploit the fact that they're just never going to be in sync with their team ever. We're either all the way in or all the way out, and that leads to major timing issues, which makes her a really, really crappy hero to play in low rank. So we want to fix that, but while still keeping the mobility of the translocator. One of the suggested ideas that I liked was that we have 2 translocators, but there is a limit to the range that you can actually use them. So you only have a 25 meter range on your translocator. In other words, if I place my translocator here, I can actually only walk this far away from it before it breaks. So what this means is that you have to use your translocator in a way to where it's almost more like an actual mobility cooldown rather than just a get out of jail free card for cycles. And you have 2 of them on longer cooldowns so that you can actually use them more dynamically. You can use them to reposition in multiple different directions. Overtuned, maybe, something to consider, I think for certain. I also think that there was also a suggestion as well that might be a little bit broken where we can actually have an overheal where every time you use translocator it heals you for 25, something that might be able to consider to give her more survivability. Not really sure if it's necessary, but an idea worth considering. The other thing that was suggested just for general viability, reduce the hack damage multiplier, so make hack still worth doing by still giving it a multiplier, but increase her base damage just as it is, so she's not reliant off of getting a hack every single time. Again, we want to keep her utility without making it a must gimmick that you actually have to have. So small adjustment there. In addition, some suggestions as well to make her less frustrating to play into as certain tanks is make the hack cooldown lockout slightly shorter for tanks, and reduce the damage benefit boost that you get on shooting tanks as well. So not just the cooldown lockout, but also the damage boost that Sombra gets is not only slightly lower period, but slightly lower especially versus tanks. Next thing with no perma stealth as well. So instead, go back to the old cooldown, 8 to 10 second duration with slightly increased movement speed. And honestly, you could even shorter than that, 6, 7, 8 seconds with increased movement speed. Again, all these numbers are up for tweaks, just initial reads. So this again allows her to reposition, use it however she'd like, but she can't be in stealth for forever. The last thing that we said is if we increase her damage, there's no real reason for her to have a 60 bullet clip size. It kind of leads to just spamming, but it's not particularly helpful in 1v1s, not particularly helpful in duels, which is part of the problem. So I think something, especially if you buff for damage, something more like a 40 damage or 40 bullet clip size, somewhere along that size would be a little bit more reasonable. Now, a couple of things that we haven't talked about, EMP might need some number tweaks. People were all suggesting potentially having EMP be like an overclock, where like the more people that you EMP, you give Sombra a buff that allows her to do more damage or gives her more HP. But the hack, the whole like concept of like hacking the targets and doing damage to the targets is significantly nerfed or even reduced, or it becomes more of a self buff where you steal their hack resources. I don't know, gobbledygook nonsense, and it becomes less of a debuff and more of a buff to the Sombra herself. Potentially, people were suggesting as well. One of my GM Sombra players was talking about a strip mechanic for the hack instead of just reducing cooldowns and damage multiplier. So it removes Zari Bubble, removes Speed Boost, Harmony Orb, Mercy Pocket, Nano Boost. Just a couple of ideas. My idea is that I think that's a little bit too gimmicky and it would be too strong or too weak depending on the circumstance, but it's something worth considering. Also, people were thinking about like removing invisible hack and maybe even making hack a skill shot like a projectile, but making it less effective versus tanks because obviously it's going to be easier to land versus tanks. There's a lot of like cool ideas that were thrown around there that were a little bit trickier to balance, but I think those are worth considering. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let's move on to the next character. Up next, we have Pharah. Now, Pharah was a very contentious one. Really hated in lower ranks, really hated in console, absolutely despised in EU top 500 in Grandmaster. The character as it is right now is pretty difficult to play mechanically, but the problem is that it is a character that demands pocket 24/7, has a very undynamic playstyle and how it functions, and can basically demands people to counter swap around it a lot of the time, and that's just very, very frustrating. A character that lives on those extremes is just not designed well for Overwatch 2. We could talk about Mercy enabling Pharah, and that was a very, very important part of this discussion. So while we talk about Mercy's problems, we also want to talk about some things that make Pharah demand the Mercy. It's not just Mercy, it's also the fact that Pharah really struggles without the Mercy, and that's part of the problem. So what we wanted to do immediately, let me actually alt-tab over here, check out this movement from Soldier in TF2, and the word on the street is that this was actually the initial design, something similar to this for Pharah, where there was a lot more of like concussive blast movement style, where there was some verticality, but it was a lot more of like explosive lateral, horizontal, and vertical. You can kind of see it here, and that is kind of gone from the hero design, and that somehow we went into the more just basically hovering in mid-air kind of style. And I think that was the number one thing that we wanted to get away from, is we want to get away from the flying isolated, flying a million miles away, or just permanently flanking with a Mercy Pocket and move to something that's a little bit more self-sufficient. So Soldier TF2 movement style, maybe more like Quake, more horizontal, vertical mobility in terms of bursts of that, not flying. I don't have any specific guidelines for that. I think it's more of a nuance in the spirit of the law in terms of how it's applied. Okay, now, a couple of things too. We want to reward directs and not splash. We can leave direct damage even potentially as it is or nerf it slightly, but we want to decrease the amount of splash damage that you can do right now. So case in point, that's just too much splash damage for a non-direct hit. And if we want to remove Pharah from being a spam character, then that needs to be one of the first things that go. Now that can be compensated by having a faster fire rate. We can fire at a faster fire rate if directs are rewarded more. And in addition to that, one of the interesting ideas that was suggested is what if we made fall off on splash also a lot weaker? So not only is splash nerfed, but the splash at a certain distance is significantly reduced. You can still hit direct hits, which are still rewarded, but splash at a distance is also nerfed. Couple other things that were really important. People were suggesting actually giving her shield HP, 50, 75, 25. There's a lot of numbers you could tweak with that, so that she actually has her own form of self-sustain. Again, shields, not armor. Shields, the blue stuff that regenerates. Barrage could function more like Valk in terms of it actually allows you to move freely and, around the map. But people were also, there's a lot of suggestions for Barrage. That was one of them. Another one was just being allowed to cancel Barrage by hitting the Q again. I think that was another one. The last one that we were talking about with Pharah as well, I almost said Soldier, Freudian slip, was giving her some sort of secondary ability, because if we take away some of her flight, I think giving her some sort of secondary mobility, whether it's a slow, maybe an AoE fire. Some people were saying an AoE fire area, like you put like one Torb shot with his ult, right? Like this area is on fire, slow burn effect. So there was another suggestion where like her ultimate functions like pulse bomb, where it charges really fast, maybe even faster than pulse bomb, but it's basically like a long cooldown that buffs another cooldown that you have. So in other words, you could use the ultimate, it charges up your next rocket. You use the ultimate, it charges up your next jump jet or your concussive blast or whatever. And maybe finding some way to incorporate that with cooldowns. But basically just giving her a little bit more ability diversity. But basically TLDR is just movement is less hover, less flight, reward direct rockets, allow her to be a little bit more self-sufficient and give her more dynamics in the playstyle. Let me know what you think in the comments. We're on to Bastion next. So Bastion was next. Now Bastion was actually one of the trickiest ones that we did, surprisingly. The problems with Bastion are pretty obvious, but they're a little bit tricky to address. He's the tank buster, which is kind of a crappy part of his identity. He has the turret, which is very cold or very hot, depending on whether he's useful, whether he's not. His ultimate is pretty hit or miss, and while he's has a little bit more dynamics than he did in Overwatch 1, which is great, he's still really lacking that performance. He's still kind of a noob stomper, while still struggling to perform in higher ranks. And so we wanted to address the potency of turret form, the fact that it's very easy to bait, and then now Bastion's a useless hero. We wanted to address the fact that recon mode feels really bad, and also maybe some of the lack of fun or nuance with the characters. The first thing we're going to talk about is actually recon form, his non-turret form. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about are 3 changes. First off, we want to make the gun feel a little bit better to use. Now, there were a lot of changes, maybe adjusting fall off, fire rate. There's lots of little tweaks there. I think that's more up to be interpreted, but a couple of things that were interesting. One was giving Bastion a passive speed boost while in recon form. Now, you might, before you think I'm crazy, mobility is survivability. Being able to move around the map, speed is survivability. I think is really, really important. And being able to adjust and move on the fly quickly, maybe like a Genji, Tracer, 10%, 5% passive speed boost. I think this would give this character more flexibility with the positions that he could take. And that would be coincided with shrinking his hitbox. You see, Bastion's a poor guy. His hitbox in recon form is absolutely massive, which means he's unbelievably easy to kill. I think for having a character that doesn't have any more self-sustain through his heal anymore, I think his hitbox needs to shrink a little bit. I think we need to give him a little bit of a speed boost, and I also think that we need to take a look at his gun a little bit closer. In addition with that, I think that his grenade needs to not damage himself. That doesn't make any sense. It's a very important part of his mobility. It shouldn't damage himself. I know self-damage in Overwatch 2 is very inconsistent. I think that this is one of those places where it really should not be it shouldn't happen to Bastion. Okay, now let's keep going on here. I think old ultimate is something that has been talked about a lot. Is that something that's going to come back? I don't know, but I think it definitely deserves some consideration. His current ultimate right now is not very interesting. It's quite weak and also not very fun to use, at least compared to old ultimate. Some people were suggesting instead of having it do 205 damage, the old ultimate direct shot, maybe it do 175 damage, so it's not a one shot, but increase the fire rate by just a little bit. That definitely would add so much more. It'd be so much more fun to play the hero with that old ultimate back, even if you had to make some adjustments. Next thing with the grenade, I would like to see the damage on this grenade reduced to 100 instead of 130. It's extremely potent right now. But hear me out, remove the self-damage and reduce the cooldown from 8 seconds to 6. So he actually has more available burst damage, more available utility, and has more available utility without it being, oh no, I'm stuck, I'm dead. So it basically it keeps his potency about the same, but gives him more mobility options. So again, a couple of ideas that last thing, the most important thing, the turret thing. Turret should not be on a cooldown. It should be a resource meter. A resource meter that lasts probably 5 or 6 seconds, and the more time that you spend in recon form, it charges back up, a lot like defense matrix. And then if you build up a certain amount of resource, whether it's a third of your resource, you can go to turret for 1 or 2 seconds. Okay, then I ran out of turret form, I go back to recon form. I'm charging up my turret form, I go back into turret form. Basically, we want turret to still be an effective part of his capability, but something that offers more dynamics and has a little bit more of a fluid playstyle without it just being, oh no, he doesn't have turret, he's useless now. That's one of the worst parts about Bastion, is that not only is he useless in recon form, but while the turret form does last 6 seconds right now, it's static. It's for the full 6 seconds, otherwise you have to cancel it. Couple of ideas. There was a lot of ideas about like how we can make turret less frustrating to play versus it is the strongest part of his kit. Maybe allowing it to headshot, but significantly nerfing the headshot multiplier, while also nerfing the base damage. So it actually does less damage with body shots now, but does slightly more damage if you can headshot. That one was a big can of worms, which a lot of people disagreed on, but it's something to consider. Leaning more into the diverse playstyles with his weapons, so he's a war robot, right? And giving him a different weapon besides just this, maybe give him a shotgun that he can fire every 8 seconds, one blast, right? Different options that the character could have that would just add a little bit more interesting nuance to the character. So Bastion, definitely something that there's a lot of tweaks that I think that would be as close to objectively good as you can, with the nade changes, with the recon form changes, the turret on a resource, but a couple of other weird ideas that you have to let me know what you think. Let's move on to Reaper. Now, Reaper was an interesting one because I don't think Reaper is necessarily fundamentally broken in his design. I just think that he struggles with a little bit of the dynamics and also misses a lot of quality of life stuff that allows him to be viable but not exactly fun to play. In addition, there's some maps and some situations that just feel terrible with him. You see, there's only a couple of short-range heroes like Reaper in the game. Tracer, pretty short-range hero. Genji, pretty short-range hero. And even if you go into the tanks, a lot of short-range heroes. But all of those short-range heroes, almost without exception, have some form of speed boost or mobility that Reaper doesn't have. You might say, oh, well, he has Wraith and he has TP. They are the worst mobility cooldowns in the game by a long shot. And that's the problem with Reaper, is he's one of the few flankers or short-range heroes that doesn't have some form of mobility. And what we're going to try to do is we're going to try and fix that. A couple of small tweaks here. Because he is an easy hero, we wanted to add a little bit more nuance, more dynamics without making him too much stronger. I think consistency with sound on his footsteps and his TP is just a nice quality of life change. That one's been a can of worms for a long time. I think the TP animation still could be faster, especially with the launch of it. So the initial, that right there, that should be faster than it is. I think even if we're talking about 0.25 seconds, however long you want it to be, it could and it should be faster. Wraith form, verticality, lower duration, faster speed. Basically budget Moira, but instead of just having to jump, you can actually launch yourself vertical. So now Wraith, you can Wraith the high ground. It may last, I mean, how long does Wraith last right now? Maybe it only lasts 1 second, but we double the speed, but you actually allow Reaper to Wraith quickly, even if it's up in the sky, verticality. And again, what we're looking for is we're looking for something that would be fun to play, but also give him more options. Wraith being faster and giving more verticality checks those boxes. So it also is something that we've already seen in the animation that he can actually do, and yet we never actually see it in game. And I think that's a huge problem. So TP needs to be faster. On one other thing too as well, we can actually shorten the range of TP if we give the Wraith the function as it is, and if the animation is faster. For example, we don't need TP to go this far if he actually has a functional, fast, vertical Wraith, and his TP has a significantly shorter animation. In fact, people were arguing that we don't necessarily need more than a 25-meter TP. There's no reason for us to go this far. This is far enough in terms of the mobility that he gives. A couple of the quality of life changes, I think being able to cancel Death Blossom is probably something. A lot of transfer-ish ults in Overwatch 2 have the ability to cancel right now, and I think having Reaper have that option as well is useful as well. And then I think one other thing that was discussed very, very heavily was two things in particular. One was his sustain. So do we like lifesteal as a mechanic? A lot of people don't like it. It encourages kind of a frontline presence and makes him kind of uninteresting to play versus. Some people were suggesting either giving him shields, similar to how we suggested with Pharah, just a little bit that can recharge. Some people were suggesting giving him a support passive to where he doesn't take damage for a period of time. He slowly regenerates, but without the shield. And that would kind of fit a little bit lore-wise here. But basically giving him some sort of small sustain besides lifesteal that might make it more interesting. I'm not really sure. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And then the other thing, a couple of ideas here as well. Should we be addressing his spread? Depending on how his mobility goes, whether it's with TP and Wraith verticality, that's the big one. Once we find out how that is, we can actually then decide if we want to start toying with his spread, reducing damage and decreasing spread. So in other words, allowing him to function more in mid ranges, while reducing his up close damage. Because the thing with Reaper right now, and this is, keep in mind, this is a nerfed Roadhog HP. He does an absurd amount of damage up close, right? That's not the problem. So do we want to scale that back a little bit and actually allow him to do better mid-range damage? That's the real question. But I think that starts once we understand how potent do we want his mobility to be first. So I guess that's something that should remain on the table. A couple of ideas. Some people were saying that maybe give him a situational speed boost. So for example, after he uses TP, he moves 25% or 10% faster for 2 seconds, just like Orisa's Javelin Spin, right? She moves faster, but then after the Javelin Spin's over, she actually moves faster. Maybe do that with TP. Maybe have a cone aim Death Blossom, so where I can choose where I'm aiming the majority of my shots, where it's still an AoE, but I'm focusing a cone area. A little bit of a detail here. Somebody was suggesting as well the movement speed penalty for Death Blossom doesn't apply if he's not touching the ground. So we're talking top ropes Death Blossom, you can move at full speed. That was kind of a corny idea, but I thought it was kind of funny. A cooler TP animation that looks less corny, something that looks a little bit cooler. Kills shorten TP cooldown by 2 seconds. Another, kind of like a Genji dash reset, you get a kill, your TP cooldown drops by 2 seconds, especially if it's a faster animation. Again, just spitballing ideas here. Reduce Death Blossom movement penalty slightly so they can move a little bit faster. And then the last one that's really important is, does Reaper deserve a mouse too? Do we want to give Reaper a secondary mouse button to shoot? Some people were saying giving him a ranged option that can charge up like a Winston right click, but can also headshot. Low damage, but allows him to finish off kills at range. But is that ranged option something that we actually want to provide in the game? I'm not really sure. So again, giving him more dynamics with his mobility, actual functional mobility, quality of life stuff first, and then deciding do we want to give him a little bit more nuance with his weapons, with his self-sustain, and with his playstyle. Let me know what you think. Next up, we have Junkrat. Now, Junkrat was a tricky one because Junkrat does have a lot of aspects of the hero that are really fun to play while still being frustrating to play against. So we talked about what's fun to play. I think mobility and hitting directs is super, super fun. I think Riptire is also super, super fun. The unhinged type of personality. What's not super fun to play is the AFK spamming down a choke playstyle, and to an extent the one shot is still a little bit frustrating when it comes to the primary fire and to the M2. Bam, the concussive combo. So we talked about how about this? So a couple of quality of life things. First thing is concussive forces more of a vertical mobility, even if it's used horizontally. For example, if I throw my concussive mine here and I move myself sideways, it still launches me up, which actually can be a little bit of a hindrance when it comes to Junkrat mobility. So more consistency where it provides horizontal or vertical mobility depending on the angle, but it's consistent. That would be a bit of a quality of life change and improve the quality of his mobility. In addition to that, probably nerf concussive mine's damage to shift it as more of a mobility cooldown while still having the potential to do damage. In addition, we wanted to rework his primary fire. So I want you to look at the arc of this damage, right? Doesn't even go, what is that, 15 meters, something like that, right? What if the arc, the movement, projectile speed, and the power of the projectile was significantly increased? Think Symmetra Orb, but with a downward arc. That would be significantly easier to hit direct shots at mid to long range. It's not that he would ever be a long range character, but I should be able to consistently hit this guy in the head or in the body with my crosshair placement, right? And what that does is that opens up his range options a little bit more, especially with having concussive mine as being a more consistent mobile option. Now, obviously that's going to be a big buff. So what we need to do then is then nerf the damage down to 190, something like that. So you're talking about, think Symmetra with an arc with more consistent mobility with concussive mine. That's kind of what we want with Junkrat. There was a couple, that was the big thing, right? Let him keep his mobility, maybe remove the one shot, give him more flexibility, give him more options to shoot and spam. If we make that change with his primary fire, you could even increase his clip size slightly. Regardless, couple of ideas with Junkrat. Let me know what you think in the comments. Riptire damage reduced, but it boops harder. So instead of doing 600 damage, it's 450 damage. Still does a lot of damage, but it actually knocks people back pretty significantly. Do we want that? Do we not want that? It was an idea. Remove bear trap. That was this was probably the biggest wall that we hit besides Torbjorn when it came to our discussions. We did not know what to do with bear trap. It's a very annoying cooldown. It's not particularly fun for Junkrat to use. So it is also like super inconsistent in the value that it gets. So people were thinking maybe a mine that's like a Venom mine, but a little bit more potent on a flank, gives you some scouting. We also thought about leaning into his peg leg, so we can have his peg leg act like a flamethrower, a short-range flamethrower with what's in front of you, kind of like it May M1, but a little bit stronger, a little bit broader AoE. We could have the, if we really want to get crazy with mobility, we could have his peg leg be essentially a short little jump jet where it just launches him straight up in the air and does a small AoE damage around you. Maybe using a burn effect. There's like lots of little tricky things that we could do with Junkrat that give him more options that are really, really fun to play with, but it's not bear trap. Bear trap is just not fun for anybody. The last thing that was suggested is potentially removing the damage on the bouncer, so there's fall off. So like once the bounce hits, the next shot that bounces off does 20 or 30% less. The only problem that people had with this is while it's technically annoying and mostly skillless, there is a little bit of skill expression with bounce shots. So it might potentially reduce his skill expression. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. The big thing for Junkrat was allow him, give him more consistent mobility with his concussive mines while taking away the direct one shot, but giving him way more consistent damage besides the AFK spam of one shot with reworking his primary fire and giving him more utility outside of his bear trap. Last idea is people are thinking more of working into his passive a little bit more with dropping mines, maybe whenever he uses his concussive mine like so. Whenever he uses it, whenever he triggers it, he actually drops a mine or two. There's some weird ideas with Junkrat. Let me know what you think in the comments. And the last one is going to be the toughest one. It's Torbjorn. And this one's the tough one. Torbjorn is just a defensive hero in a non-defensive game. I think the whole concept of placing your turrets, and whether it was armor packs or even his old ultimate, and even his current ultimate, feels a very defensive-oriented playstyle, kind of a reactive playstyle, and that just doesn't really work in Overwatch 2. You've noticed that a lot of the Overwatch 2 hero reworks have migrated away from that, and even a hero like Symmetra, who is very, very defensive-oriented, has so much more flexibility with her mobility, whether it's with her TP, with her turrets, and even her primary fire that gives her more options, and Torb just doesn't. So Torb was the one where, after a lot of brainstorming, we had a couple of ideas to lean into, but unfortunately the least concrete out of all the heroes. The problem with Torbjorn is that his turret is either too strong for being a passive part of his kit that auto aims. It's not skill-less, but it's about as close as we have in Overwatch 2. And his primary fire is just spam oriented. Even his overload just means more shooting at head height. I just had a Torb coaching session the other day, and we spent more time talking about crosshair placement than we did about actually aiming your shots. And I think that's a big problem with the character. It leans into his ultimate, it leans into his turret. It's more of I set up and I go. And while that not only makes him frustrating to play against, it also makes him very weak in situations that it just shouldn't be like that. Why is Torbjorn so bad on attack? That's not very fair. That's not how Overwatch 2 is designed. We want here every character to be viable, every character to have that dynamics, and Torbjorn is missing that. So we targeted the problems to be about turret is either too potent or right now too weak. His overload is really, really, really strong, but not particularly useful to use. The movement speed is nice. So how do we make Torbjorn a more reactive / proactive character rather than just drop the turret in a space and hope that somebody walks into it? Even in attack, a lot of times the turret is more used as a meat shield than is anything else. And what we came up with was have turret be a temporary deployable, not a permanent deployable. You see, the toughest thing that we had to come to terms with is that hammer and repairing things is just not viable. It's just not feasible. It's just not a part. Either you have something that's too hard to break, which is frustrating, or you have a hammer that just never repairs anything. People were talking about, well, what if you had your hammer repair Symmetras, teleporters, or turrets, or you could repair you would never do that. Never would it actually be a viable solution in a game. So what ends up happening is you have hammer be entirely useful, that entire dynamic is useless. So what do we do instead? Well, the idea is that Torbjorn on a cooldown can summon a deployable AI, whether that's a turret, a drone, a slicer, like in the PvE mode, that actually goes out and does something for you. And it doesn't last long, 5, 6, 7, maybe it tops 8 seconds, and then it automatically detonates, or it dies, right? And what that does is that allows Torbjorn to be way more dynamic with how he uses something, and he's not as reliant on a setup phase. He can actually proactively go out and use it, and heck, even choose a different turret, or a different AI, a different robot, a different tool, depending on the circumstance. And what you do is you shift, that thing builds itself. You don't use your hammer, and it allows Torbjorn to actually use his weapon. In addition to that, his weapon probably needs a slower fire rate and maybe even a faster projectile speed. If we slow his fire rate, maybe we can make the arc on his weapon a little bit less punishing. Maybe we can make the, heck, maybe we could lean more into his mouse too. Make him more of a heavy shotgun here. But right now, his AFK spam is just not fun for really either party. And I think giving him more dynamics with the turrets that he could choose and making them temporary and reactive rather than just place it there and leave it is going to be a lot more intuitive with Overwatch 2, because it just isn't feasible to set this up and then repair it. It just doesn't work, guys. There is no way to make it work in Overwatch 2. Now, a couple of ideas we also had as well. Maybe WeWork Imp Turret or the AI robots, whatever deployables he has, to have a burst value on their initial placement, which means that, again, it's less about the long-term value of having an AI like Bob or something shoot for you, but it's about the initial value that you get when you place it. Maybe more overbuff. The overload doesn't actually necessarily give him much more survivability and fire rate, but it adds a small burn effect on his shots while keeping the movement speed. Maybe a sonic turret, drone, slicer. Like I said, we had a lot of ideas for the typical turrets. And one idea that I had, if we want to use the hammer, super corny. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Elden Ring, but there is a two-handed weapon called a giant crusher, and I want you to look at the animation here. Imagine if Torbjorn did a similar animation but much faster, and it was used as mobility, and it shot him forward slightly and did a small AoE stun. And if it had a little bit of mobility, it could be used defensively, it could be used offensively. Again, the damage wouldn't be significant, but he did that with his hammer. Would that look corny as all get out? Yes. Would it be significantly more impactful than what we have now for hammer? Yes, and it would also be significantly more fun. Again, my idea, pretty corny. I don't know if it actually would work in effect. It would look sick though, and again, it would give him something to do with hammer offensively besides repair, because that just isn't it with Overwatch 2. Now, his ultimate is definitely a bit of a contentious one. It's not really that offensive, but people were also thinking, again, maybe we could rework the overload or his ult and core to provide a burn effect with this weapon, allow him to deploy turrets and deployables 2 at a time instead of 1 at a time. There's all sorts of little tiny things that you could do with the ultimate that might make it a little bit more interesting, but we need this here to not just be an old defensive fossil, which it lines, he needs to be, Reinhardt is an old dude, but he's fresh as a daisy, right? He can contribute all sorts of things. Why? It's not fair that Torbjorn, the old dude, is still an old dude in Overwatch 2, and I think that we need to go back to his whole identity as a deployable creator and builder and lean into that while updating it and modernizing it towards Overwatch 2. So that pretty much wraps it up. Again, the overall idea is to give characters more dynamics, make them more fun and more interesting to play, while also a little bit less frustrating to play into. The big disclaimer though is that we didn't really talk about hard numbers, because most of these are kind of, I wouldn't necessarily say net buffs, but they could be very potentially powerful in the right hand. So I think when it comes to the number tweaks, that's something that we need to be more open to and see what actually happens. So keep in mind, I'm not married to any of these changes. These are just some of my suggestions, and obviously I doubt that we'll see any of these changes, but my main takeaway was that if I'm going to criticize development, I need to provide something on my end. Now, are they better than what we have? That's up for debate, but I had a lot of fun doing it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and also let me know who you think we should be doing next. Stay tuned to my Twitter and my Discord, because we will be doing more of these in the future. And like I said, the majority of these ideas were not mine. So these were awesome ideas that we had from the community, and I'd love to have you guys involved next time. Have a good rest of your day.